good Halsey at Guadalcanal. We saw a less good Halsey at Leyte Gulf, where he gets fooled and is lured out of position, hanging out my little task unit, Taffy 3, kind of hanging those guys out to dry. So coming to the Guadalcanal campaign off of writing Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, I had to get over the conditioning I'd received doing interviews with these sailors at Taffy 3, a great many of whom told me flat out, now these are the opinions of old men who retired as seaman first class, okay, but they all said Admiral Halsey should have been court-martialed. Take that with a grain of salt, but it is reflective of their resentment and their, the life-altering horror they were subjected to because of that tactical error, and frankly, the poor communications between the entirety of the Naval Command, and for that matter, MacArthur's command at 6th Army headquarters. But all kinds of fingers to point, I suppose, when things go wrong, even when things go right. What went right at Guadalcanal was Admiral Halsey came down on orders from Nimitz to relieve Admiral Gormley, and Halsey's first message to his men was, "There are no uniforms here. We are all South Pacific fighting. We are U.S. South Pacific Fighting Force." And he saw to it that he went to Guadalcanal and visited with General Vandergrift of the 1st Marine Division to show him that he was present, that he, Halsey, the U.S. Navy, was present, and he promised Vandergrift all the support that he needed, and by the end of it, that was a promise fulfilled.
Yeah, it's like I said. I guess it was the gallant hours for him, and the gallant years. But one of the things that I often wondered is if that success, and then a couple of other strings of success, and he was a very capable sailor, gruff, tough, very instinctive. When you start believing your own press, I guess, after a certain point, and I wonder if there was a sense of invulnerability in terms of his decision making as time went on. I think, as you pointed out beautifully in The Last Stand, there were many people around him, giving him every signal that this is most likely a Japanese ruse and this is not what we should be doing. And I even, one of the things that really I still remember to this day reading was, the response from Admiral Michener: "If he wants my opinion, he'll ask for it." Which
that's right. Well, but by the time the Leyte campaign rolls around, Halsey has missed his chance to kill Japanese aircraft carriers so many times that he cannot hold himself back from chasing that little decoy force. And so, in spite of all the good advice he received and a lot of the good intelligence about navigational lights set up in the channel in San Bernardino Strait, he couldn't restrain himself from chasing those carriers. And
no, he couldn't.
The rest of it was just communications errors, and frankly, Admiral Kincaid deserves a good share of the blame. He was 7th Fleet,
right? And
this was his unit that got hung out to dry. Shouldn't 7th Fleet have taken care of its own, sea reconnaissance? I suppose so. So Kincaid never gets mentioned, but there's plenty of blame to go around here, and it wasn't just on Halsey. This may be the only. So going back to Halsey at Leyte just briefly, it may be the only case where I think Nimitz kind of has a black eye for planning and decision making, because it was Nimitz who kind of gave Halsey this very free-ranging authority to kind of roam and pursue the Japanese fleet, even when his principal responsibility, as many saw it, was to cover and support the landings. And so we didn't see that in the Marianas campaign. I guess we're gonna get to that book here in a minute, but the fleet at flood tide. But Spruance conducted himself very differently in the Marianas, and of course that would become controversial, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's funny, of all the leaders, and I'm fine transitioning over to the fleet at flood tide, because I don't know why, but ever, since I was a young teenager or whatever, and started getting fascinated with the Navy, and maybe it spawned from Midway or whatever, and I visited the USS Spruance, which was the namesake of a destroyer class for many, many years, and a very proud class of destroyers as well. He was always my favorite naval leader. Number one was his style, his mannerisms, the way he approached things, detailed oriented, data driven. He was very, very thorough in the way that He ran things even though he chased Halsey around for many, many years, they couldn't have been two different approaches and there's many roads to Rome. It doesn't make one better or worse, just two very different approaches on how to execute a plan and to forge ahead. People would say that Spruance was the more conservative and Halsey was the more aggressive. But as far as results, Spruance, I don't know. I always felt he should have got that 5th star.
Yeah, well, the reason he didn't, I think, in the end was because Halsey did one thing that Spruance never did do, and that was hold major area commands. Halsey had South Pacific forces,
True.
and also and performed his best while in that role. And so I think at the end of the war, when Congress allocated a certain number of five-star billets, Spruance was left out, not on merit, but on track record. I mean, not on perceived skill and talent, but on just the fact that Halsey had done one major thing that he hadn't, and there was a secondary factor. Maybe it was primary, I don't know, but Halsey was the public face of the Navy as far as the public was concerned. And much to Spruance's credit, he accepted that verdict and moved on graciously without recrimination into his role as president of the Naval War College, where really that was his dream job, to study the war as an intellectual exercise. He used to write letters to his wife. I think they talked often about how he found war so interesting. Mm-hmm. And she said, Raymond, how can you say that? War is horrible. How can you say you find it so interesting? And he said, well, it just is. So he was an intellectual man. He was very restrained in his personal manner and in his style of communication. He never lost his cool. He had abundant personal energy, which was never better demonstrated than when he was pacing at high speed around the decks of his flagship each and every day and each and every evening. He felt that physical fitness, that physical fitness kept the brain sharp, that the body was merely a support system for the, for the brain. And he was explicit about that, and he had a view. He was also very clear about ends and means and about the most efficient course to link the two. And so when it came to, when the task came to invade the Marianas in 1944, he knew exactly what his mission was, and he was not about to be lured out of position by the Japanese, who were known to use diversionary tactics, trying to, fool the enemy as to their intent and get their enemy out of position. He knew his job was to support Admiral Turner's landing forces at Saipan, and he held his carriers close as the greatest naval air victory in history was won on his watch. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, 380 claimed air-to-air kills by our Hellcat squadrons, and yet Admiral Mitcher and his task group commanders never forgave Spruance for holding them on a leash when they issued their request to chase westward. Spruance would not let them chase westward, and so that the recrimination over that decision carried all the way to Leyte Gulf, and arguably was connected to Halsey's decision to recklessly chase that decoy force out of position. And it's a fascinating continuum. It's a fascinating leadership study. Halsey and Spruance were closest of friends, dating back to their time, together at the Naval Academy, and Turner as well. Turner was a very close friend from the Naval War College. They were a true brotherhood. They worked very well together, but boy, they could not have been more different as men.
No, all three.
It was always on it was always on Spruance's mind that it was a dangerous thing to become famous, because if you became famous, then you had this independent persona marching around out there. You're the person the public thought you were. And Spruance thought it was dangerous if the existence of that famous person the public thought you were might compel you to do something to act in line with it. Namely, do what the public thinks you should do instead of doing what reason compels you to do. And so Spruance always drew that distinction. He drew it very explicitly in his letters home to his wife. He put it that way. I believe I omitted that quotation from my book. I think that was just a cut and paste, a lapse in cutting and pasting. I was looking for it the other day. I don't think it's in the book, but Spruance did say, he said, I fear the corrupting influence of that public persona and what it might lead one to do to satisfy it.
Yeah, I don't remember. And even reading his biography, Quiet Warrior, I don't remember that quote. So that's Yeah, between the two books, I can't remember that having read it,
Yeah,
but he
I don't think
yeah,
it's there.
no, it's incredible. But I this is why I love not only reading your books but having the honor to talk to you. I mean, to be could be up all night doing this. This is my world. I look at behind me on my desk. I had commissioned a while ago a person to go out and hunt down signatures from the 6 leading admirals of World War II. So I've got King, Nimitz, and Halsey, Spruance, Ingram, and Hewitt. With their pictures underneath it. It's really cool. And
Okay.
Spruance is dead center, because that's where I always even in my job today, I take a lot of lessons from him and how he approaches things. But that quote's powerful, because think of a 4-star admiral commanding the largest naval force in history and remaining that humble and that focused on the mission, not making any of it about him. That's amazing to me.
Right.
Amazing to me. I don't know how you could
No,
do it.
That really was a defining trait of his, wasn't it? It was never about him. He was a man of great empathy, and yet he had a warrior's heart. There are 2 instances that I point out in Fleet at Flood Tide where Spruance really shows you that he was a fighter. One was in the manner in which the fleet struck the Japanese base of Truk in what was known as Operation Hailstone. He personally led a squadron of battleships in sort of a victory lap around the island, sinking cripples and doing all this stuff at a time when the aviators had the whole affair very well in hand. It was kind of a shocking act of sort of shockingly gratuitous act of naval showmanship, if you will. And then the other one was when he found out that Admiral Nagumo was found dead on Saipan, victim of a suicide. Nagumo, after the disgrace of the defeat at the Battle of Midway, had been put in charge of the garrison on Saipan, where he was in charge of 38,000 Japanese troops nominally. Japanese army didn't much like having an admiral running their show, but he was nominally in command. And when the report came back from 2nd Marine Division Intelligence that the body of Admiral Nagumo was found, he again wrote home to his wife about the rush of personal satisfaction he had at that news, knowing that Nagumo had opposed him at Midway. And I thought that was a very telling moment that showed that, just because somebody looks kind of nervous in front of a camera and is very mild in their manner, that they are not a raging warrior within. And I have no doubt that Spruance was that man.
No doubt. And I think that was the trait that I admired most. There are people that just get it done. They have, and as you mentioned before, he was focused on physical fitness. He was focused on making sure you got enough sleep, all the things that could make sure that you were as sharp as you could possibly be in your job. And he also empowered his people very well, and he was a good delegator. And I thought that he also had a great way of addressing when somebody might be doing something wrong. He wasn't a yeller or a screamer. And I thought one of the neater things that I had read about him was a story when he was on some destroyer somewhere, and the young captain or the officer of the deck, whoever was in charge, decided to ramp up the speed of the ship to give him a ride to show him just how fast the ship could go. And Spruance just he stood on the bridge during that whole event, and then just as he was leaving, he grabbed the binder that had his standing orders, left the bridge, but left it open where, it specifically said that no ship, unless they were in combat conditions, were to go past whatever it was, 15 or 20 knots, right? But he never said a word, but made sure that this guy got the message, right? I thought that's was
classic.
That's a real cool way of dealing with it, right? I mean, he didn't dress him down or whatever, but I could just imagine what that young officer was thinking when he saw that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then off Guam, there, at a time when the Fifth Fleet was feverishly sending out search planes looking for the Japanese carrier task force. We've got the big mariners flying boats flying out from Saipan Roadstead. We've got long range search planes, F-6Fs with extra tanks. We can go out to about 450 miles. Feverishly searching for the Japanese fleet, all to no avail. The following afternoon comes a report that we found the fleet And then a belated report comes in